everybody. Thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Kelsey, and we're going to spend the hour talking about all sorts of tips and tricks for picking up points on the reading section. We're going to be doing some SAT questions today, but a lot of the strategies that work on SAT reading can translate right over to ACT reading. And this can be kind of one of the trickier sections on the test, right? It's up first. You've got on the SAT, you've got 65 minutes to answer 52 questions in 5 different passages, and it's a lot. It's all multiple choice. Some of the questions can take a while to understand what they're really asking you to find. It's timed pretty aggressively, and so we're going to spend some time looking at the very best way to approach each one of these passages and how to avoid some of those very tricky trap answers. So let's think for a minute about the difference between the English classes that you've had your whole life, more or less, and what's being asked of you in SAT reading. So this first one here says, analysis, interpretation, and critical thinking are rewarded. Do we think that that applies for reading in the SAT or in your English class or both? Thinking about with English class, they're always asking for, your creative responses to make connections between different sources that you might have read. But on the SAT, we don't really have that opportunity, right? They're all multiple choice. So this one's going to be just your English class. What do you guys think about prior knowledge of a topic? Is that going to help you out with SAT reading or your English class or both? Again, with SAT reading, you've really just got that one little passage to read. Prior knowledge doesn't really help you out on SAT, unfortunately, but it's definitely going to help you out in English class, of course. How about explaining your thinking in short answer or essay format? We love to do that in English class. How many of you have ever taken an English test that was completely multiple choice? That's pretty rare, right? Most of the time, your English teacher is interested in your thoughts, your feelings, your explanation. But with SAT reading, it's all multiple choice. You don't have that opportunity. Um, how about knowledge of the life and times of the author? Does that help you out? If you guys are picking up a pattern here, that's going to be really just your English class. Is there a need to speed read in the passages? Not necessarily. We're actually going to cover that here in a minute. Great question. But if you guys are picking up a pattern here, knowing anything about the subject or the author, any of that, great for English class, not really going to help you out with SAT reading. And so that brings us to this final one, which is really at the heart of what makes SAT reading difficult, but how you can use that to help you beat it, is nothing matters except what's actually written in the passage. Your universe is in the lines of the passage that you're reading. And I see another question, do we read the entire passage for the main idea questions? We're going to get to that as well. But you'll see that my recommendation is not to read the whole passage up front. We're going to cover that here actually next. So here at the Princeton Review, we've had a lot of really smart people think about the very best way to approach these tests for a very long time. And we have landed on what we perceive to be the best practice for how to get as many points as possible, how to maximize your score on reading. And so before we even actually get into this basic approach, what I want you all to consider is whether or not it makes sense for you to do the passages in the order that they appear. Let's say that the very first passage of 5 is, it was written in the 1800s. It's about some poet you've never heard of. It's got some old-timey language, and it's just really boring. And some of the questions are really hard. After you spend maybe 15 minutes slogging through that passage, are you going to be more or less likely to feel good, to feel energized, to get questions right on the later passages? Probably less likely. Yeah, those stress hormones, that frustration can actually carry through and affect your performance later on. So it's a great idea to do the passages in an order that makes sense for you. Do the easy ones first. Do the interesting ones first. Some of these have charts and graphs. If you love those questions, if you're able to knock those out of the park, pick those passages out, do them first. Save that old-timey one for last. So if you run out the clock on the passage where you're most likely to miss some questions, make sure it's going to be that very last one. Vocab questions, we'll get to those too. But they're all coming with the idea of following this basic approach. You want to use this for every single question in reading. So once you've identified a passage that you want to start out with, whether it's the first one or not. It's a topic that interests you, that doesn't, bore you to tears. You want to make sure that you read that little blurb that's at the top. That's the little nugget of information that gives you the author, the year it was written, the title. Sometimes they'll give you some definitions of some terms that show up in the passage. It can be really tempting under the gun of the clock ticking to skip over that, to think, I don't care who the author is, I don't need to know when it was written. But sometimes they actually hide answers to questions in that little blurb. So reading that little piece that comes right before the passage is an essential first step. Got to do that first. And after that, you want to go in and actually select and understand a question. And you might be thinking, wait a minute, how can I do that if I haven't even touched the passage yet? But that's the beauty of this approach. You don't get points on SAT reading for understanding the passage beautifully, for really getting it. You get points for answering questions correctly. Um, so let's spend our time wisely doing that. So first you want to pick a question and understand what it means, particularly on the SAT. A lot of these questions aren't really phrased as questions. They're kind of open-ended sentences. So you want to make sure you think if it's asking for you to find a what or a why, or if it's one of those vocabulary and context questions, make sure you know what your task is. And then once you've internalized that to yourself, you want to read what you need. Go back to the passage, find, if you've got a line reference, if you've got a lead word, some vocabulary word that's going to jump out of the text at you that was in the question. You want to read above and below a little bit to get context for what that subject is. And make sure you read it carefully. Read it, word for word all the way through, looking for the answer to what you understood to be the subject of that question. And as you're reading actively. You're not reading so that you get to the bottom and you think, wait, what did I just read? We've all had that experience. Read actively, read looking for a prediction to the question. Try to put it in your own words. And this is before you even look at the answer choices, because as we all know, there's a lot of trap answers that look really, really attractive. Lots of really, really great questions, you guys. And using this basic approach is going to help you with that. So let me get to the last step and then I'll go back and answer those individual questions. You want to generate the prediction before you look at the answers. And then process of elimination is pretty straightforward. You want to go back and basically find the best match for what your prediction was. Eliminate anything that's inconsistent with what you read and that doesn't match up with what you generated that prediction to be. So let's see, for rhetorical questions, it's the same thing. You want to make sure that you're generating a prediction. If you do, if you get it down to 2, that's when you want to go back into the text and reread again and see if you can narrow it down. See if you can identify that one of those is written to be one of those trap answers that we're going to talk about next. I see another one. Do you answer questions which ask about the main purpose of the passage without reading the whole passage? Save main idea questions for last, because let me give you a clue here. When the people who write this test are writing the questions, they think they're very smart. And they're writing the questions that clue you in on what they think the main idea of the question is. So after you've answered all the specific questions, even if you haven't read the whole passage top to bottom, first of all, you've read a lot of that passage in order to answer those questions. And the subjects of those questions are going to follow along some theme. And that theme is really likely to be close to what the main idea of the passage is. So you don't necessarily need to read the whole thing from top to bottom. And if you're totally unsure of what the question is asking, save it for last, skip it. There's no reason to spin your wheels on any one question on this test. You've got 65 minutes to do 52 questions. That's really fast. And so if you're totally stumped, give yourself permission to say, you know what, there's other points out there that I'm more likely to get, and go get them. Give yourself permission to skip questions that you're just totally lost on. It's hard to do. Your English teachers, your math teachers, your teachers in general don't write tests such that you have to make that decision, but with standardized testing, you kind of do. So that's something weird to kind of wrap your head around, but it's definitely the best approach here so that you're not wasting your time on a question that you might get wrong anyway. Okay, I see another question. Sorry, do we go straight for questions based on the entire passage? You want to do those later, do those last. And how do you avoid the could be true trap answers? We're going to talk a lot about this as we go through the practice questions today. If you're torn between two, go back, reread, look for traps. Look for something that's too extreme. Look for something that sounds plausible but isn't supported by the text. For every single right answer on this test, you need to be able to take your pencil in your hand and point to something in the passage that supports the answer you choose. You're not going to have to make these big creative inferences like you do in English class. It's going to be there in the text. Yes, we are going to do example questions today. Specific tips for history passages, not necessarily. You want to use the same approach for all of them. But if you've identified, Rebecca, that you struggle the most with history passages, then for you, it might make sense to always identify the history passages and save them for last. If you're doing better on those other passages, do them first. Do them at the beginning when you're fresh, when you're not yet frustrated, and then save those history ones for last if those are consistently being difficult for you. Um, okay, some more questions. I think I've already answered some of these. If there's a question where you have to choose which word best fits, but you don't know what any of the options mean, are there any tricks? I mean, at this point, I would just recommend, to build up your vocabulary. There's lots of great flashcard apps out there. But again, if you don't know what the words mean, then that's a question that's not worth your time. That's might be one where you want to eliminate anything that you can, and guess among the answers that you haven't eliminated and move on and try to get more points elsewhere. Every point on this test is worth exactly the same thing. Whether it's an easy question or a hard question, they're all equally weighted. So you just want to make sure you're picking up as many points as you can. How will we be able to solve questions which ask us to link passage one to, so for the dual passages? So you want to make sure that you're doing all the questions for passage one first, all the questions for passage two first. Make sure you understand the relationship between them. That's usually articulated in the blurb. And make sure you're doing those ones about both last. Let's see, tough passages, again, I recommend saving those for last, and then just taking them one question at a time. It's not necessary to read a passage all the way through and understand it completely. It's necessary to get questions right. And a lot of times to get a question right, you don't have to read the whole thing. You just need to read a little part and understand it. Okay, lots of good questions coming in, you guys. I love it. So for daily habits to master active reading, you should read every day. And it doesn't have to be Shakespeare, but it shouldn't be Twitter, somewhere in between. Read an article in the newspaper, pick up a paper copy of the newspaper or a magazine and read something that you wouldn't normally, and just try to read it from top to bottom without picking up your phone, without getting distracted, and just practice reading. Exposing yourself to different material is always a good idea. And just try to understand where the author's coming from. If there's an argument, try to understand both sides of it. But just basically exposing yourself to reading is a lifelong skill, and some very particular elements of it are tested on the SAT. So daily reading can definitely help build that, but you just need to keep in mind that to get a great score on SAT reading, we need to master the skills to get questions right, which is what we're going to focus on today. Um, okay. People say to read the introduction first and the last paragraph second. Do you think it helps if you do so? So some people are able to read the blurb and go pick a question, no problem. For some people, that makes them really anxious and it doesn't actually help them perform any better on the test because they feel like they're going in blind, and you know yourself best. And so an option, like a middle ground there, might be to read the blurb and to quickly skim through. Instead of the first and last paragraph, what I like better is the first sentence in every paragraph. Just read the first sentence in every paragraph quickly. Don't reread anything at this point, but that'll give you an idea of what's going on inside that passage. And that should give you basically an anchor for what's going on in that passage before you get to the questions, if that approach of skipping the passage completely makes you uncomfortable. So for giving more attention to social studies passages than history, again, you know yourself best. And at this point that you guys know already what the different subjects of passages are is fantastic. That means that you're well into your practice, and it seems like a lot of you are kind of tuned in to what some strengths and weaknesses are for you. Um, and so again, it's the same approach no matter what the subject of the passage is. You want to do the ones that you're stronger in first. Um, but yeah, I don't know about more attention. Like you want to give your full attention to every part of this test. And I know that that's easier said than done, but that's my recommendation. So with literature passages, again, just, make sure you're picking up all the points you can on the other passages. Slow down and make sure you're not rushing through those. Pick up the points on the passages that you know to be your strength. Um, and then, yeah, just continue to do practice. And with every practice test or every practice problem you do, the time you spend reviewing the questions that you got wrong, that's just as valuable as doing the practice in the first place. It's not fun, particularly for a full length 4-hour practice test afterwards to go back and review everything that you missed. But that's where you actually start to see improvements. You can pick up on patterns of different questions that you're likely to miss. And so that's what I recommend for anybody who's looking to improve their reading score. Do practice and then revisit the ones that you missed. Look at the answers. And a particularly good question to ask yourself in that case is, what should I have done differently to get this question right? If you articulate that to yourself again and again and again, you'll start to rewire the way that your brain is approaching those questions, and that should help you get them right the next time. The best strategy for line reference questions. So we're going to do a lot of examples. So hopefully a lot of these specific questions will get answered as we go through there. So please feel free to keep those coming as we go through. But the next thing I want to do is put names to the types of most common trap answers that you'll see on the SAT. Um, don't really need to know specific literary devices for these passages. You don't need to study a lot. Again, your whole universe is inside the passage. So we put these into 3 kind of loose categories. The first one is called mostly right, slightly wrong. This is a particularly common trap for those answer choices that are a little bit longer, 2, 3, maybe 4 lines each, where you start to read it and it sounds really good. And then maybe you lose focus or you say, okay, it's starting to sound really good. I don't have time to read this whole thing. I'm just going to pick it. But then they sneak something in at the end that makes it wrong. It's inconsistent with what's actually in the passage. And that's no good. If an answer choice is a little bit wrong, it's wrong. You can't pick it. So you need to be really careful of choosing answer choices, particularly the longer ones that start to sound right. Every single part needs to be supported by the passage. The other one is could be true, but isn't supported by the text. This is a really common trap. And this kind of plays into how you've all been conditioned to basically make your own inferences and use creative problem solving in your English classes, right? This could be true. This character's motivation could be this, and then you get to write an essay and explain your logic behind that. You can't do that on this test. Even if something sounds totally plausible, even if it maybe is true, if you happen to know it from outside knowledge, if it isn't in the text, you can't choose it. You have to be able to take your pencil and point to something that supports your answer choice. So just because something sounds pretty good, that's not good enough. It needs to be supported by the text. And another really, really tricky trap is this idea of deceptive language. What we mean by deceptive is they're basically recycling terms that showed up in the text. So if you're reading really fast, you can pick up on some words that you just read in the paragraph, and they're kind of garbled together in an answer choice in a way that makes you say, oh, I just read all those words. This must be the answer. But instead, what I want you all to do, if you see a bunch of words that you just read, that should be a red flag for you, and you should look out to that as a suspicious trap. Most of the time, the right answers in SAT reading, they're paraphrases of what's in the text. They're not going to contain a lot of the exact same words that you just read. Um, okay, I see a few questions I want to get to before we actually get into some passages. Do questions in reading have specific patterns? No, not necessarily. You're going to have those paired sets in every passage, but they're chronological, if that's what you mean. In general, the questions in SAT reading will appear in chronological order in accordance with the passage, so that can help you narrow down a window if you're missing a line reference. But that's going to be the case for every passage, not just anyone. So in terms of pacing, this isn't a pacing heavy lesson. This is a strategy heavy lesson, but if you use the strategy and if you become comfortable with the strategy, that's going to help out your pacing. They're tied together for sure. Um, Blogs or books to increase your skills, definitely. Yep. Anything that's longer than 144 characters is a good place. And I do like to recommend to build your reading skills, to build your vocabulary, to go outside your comfort zone a little bit. Read something that's not necessarily something that you're totally familiar with. I think that's a great way to just build on those skills. Will there be a live session on the SAT essay anytime in the near future? I don't have the schedule in front of me. I can pass that along to the powers that be, that's a request that you guys have. I know there's a lot of questions about the SAT essay, but yeah, I don't know that one off the top of my head. Yes, we've got some questions today, and for every wrong answer, we're gonna name a trap. We're gonna say, this is how they're trying to trick you, and this is how you can beat it. It's gonna be really satisfying when you guys start to recognize those traps on your own. That's my favorite thing. Okay, any more questions before we get into some practice problems? I'm really excited to get into this. Okay, I'm ready. You, let's do it. So imagining, this is the first section, the first passage in the section we read, and it's pretty interesting. It was written in the last century. Um, we're gonna do this one, and we've read our blurb, and now we've decided to do this question. So we're gonna select and understand a question, which is gonna be question 34. And this one reads, the phrases an awful lot and all of a sudden serve to emphasize Sarah's. So see how this isn't really phrased as a question. This is an open-ended sentence. So what we need to do is understand the question. And what I want us all to zero in on is that this is a why question. And we can know that based on these words serve to. So we can think of serve to as like in order to, or to phrase this like a question, it's more like, you know, why does the author use an awful lot and all of a sudden? We're not going to do any parallel questions today. But so why did the author use these phrases? What is it emphasizing? So let's go in and read the phrase in section in context here. We see those phrases appear at the beginning of this paragraph. So we see that Daddy was seeing an awful lot of his new friend. One of the rooms in his house was all of a sudden full of her stuff. Neither Sarah nor her brother was allowed there anymore. It had started with a few dinners and shopping trips, and now it seemed that their father's friend basically lived in the house and was shifting around some furniture that had been in place for as long as Sarah could remember. So we want to know basically what those phrases function as. And a really great way to get that impression is to actually read it without that stuff in there. So let's take those out all of a sudden in an awful lot. So Daddy was seeing his new friend. One of the rooms in his house was full of her stuff. So now it reads more neutral, a little less surprised. So we're going to generate that prediction that, there's this suddenness, this urgency that those phrases are putting in here, right? Taking those out makes it seem a little bit more clinical almost. So let's look at answer A. We're going to use process of elimination and eliminate anything that doesn't match up with our prediction. Disapproval of her father's new girlfriend. Could be true, right? Sarah could very well disapprove of her father's new girlfriend, but do we have any evidence that those phrases are functioning that way? Okay, so you should read a paragraph to answer each question. So I recommend reading about 5 lines above and 5 lines below wherever you see the line references. So we see those here, the awful lot, all of a sudden, just to give yourself context, because let me clue you in on a secret here. They love to give a window, like say lines 37 to 42, and then line 43 has the word but, and it gives a huge contrast to what was going on there. So you never want to just read the lines that they give you. You always want to make sure you read for context. Not strictly necessary to read this whole paragraph to answer this question, but just a good idea to know kind of what's going on here. Okay. So again, we don't have any evidence to support this idea of disapproval. It could be true. It sounds plausible, but it's not supported. So we can't pick A. What about B? A wish that things could be as they once were. An awful lot and all of a sudden, not really nostalgic words. Again, if we're putting ourselves in Sarah's shoes, if we're trying to write an essay from Sarah's point of view, yeah, we might include some ideas that include that she's nostalgic for how things used to be. But those phrases just don't serve to function in that way. So we can't pick B either. Unwillingness to accept a new person into her life. That sounds a lot like A. Again, it's going with this idea of basically putting words in her mouth and, assigning feelings to her that we don't have evidence for. Got to have evidence for it. Doesn't match up with our prediction, so we can't pick C here either. And so now we're hoping that we've done a good job with process of elimination. We're reading through answer D, surprise at a new development in her father's home. That matches up completely with our prediction, this suddenness, this urgency, um, and we're going to want to pick D here because this one is the only one that is strictly supported by the text. Okay, so see how they write, answers that sound good but not supported. You should always be able to point to something like this word sudden matches up with surprise. That's how closely to the text you need to stick with SAT reading. Okay. So those are some trap answers. Let's see if we can find some more in a different question. So moving on to another passage completely. Um, is it better to just read the entire passage once first? So no, for most students, reading the entire passage all the way through top to bottom before you get to the questions is not the best approach. And that's because it takes too much time. You're not likely to remember the details anyway. And the passages, you're going to have to go back and reread. And it's an English test that's open book, and you don't have to read the book before you get there. And the book is pretty short. So if that were the case, would you read the book ahead of time? Like, probably not, right? Um, I really, if you feel like it's uncomfortable for you to completely skip the passage before going into the questions, try reading the first sentence just to give yourself context. But really, you get points for getting questions right on this test. You don't get points for understanding the passage. It would be kind of a bummer if you got stuck reading through to understand something that was confusing to you, and then there weren't any questions on it at all. That's a waste of your time, and we don't want to do that. Um, okay. So let's try another one with question 12. What does the first sentence suggest about the name of the nation of Iraq? So it's good that, we don't have a line number, but we have, a place to go, which is going to be the first sentence. But we don't want to just read the first sentence. We want to read the next one too, just so that we get a little bit more context for what's going on in this passage. So let's read that together. To take one example, the name Iraq is not quite applicable to all its citizens as the name France, Portugal, or the United States are in their own regions. For many Westerners, nationality is a given and ultimately trumps the more local identifications of town, city, or state. Okay, so we're asked to find what does the first sentence suggest about the name of the nation Iraq? So here we see that the author is kind of drawing a contrast between these other countries, saying it's not quite as applicable. Um, but for many Westerners, nationality ultimately trumps the local identifications. So let's keep reading. In Iraq, as the Bush administration learned, religious distinctions are more meaningful than national similarities. So we had to read all the way down here to really get at what else is more important. If nationality is more important for these Western countries, what else is it? In Iraq, well, it's these religious distinctions. If it says the first sentence, you should absolutely still read beyond that. You're going to need the context. They're never going to, just give you exactly what you need to read. You need to read above and below. Here, we don't have anywhere to go above because this is the beginning of the passage, but you absolutely need to read a little bit beyond in order to get some context. So we see there's this distinction being drawn between national identity and religious identity. So we want to keep that in mind and eliminate anything that isn't supported by that prediction, isn't supported by the text. So let's read through answer A. The name of the country comes from the region in which the majority of Shias live. We don't have anything to support that at this point. Um, the name Iraq is being in contrast to this identity, not to these particular Shias. So that means that we can eliminate answer A. For answer B, the name of the country has less significance in Iraq than it does in other countries. That matches up pretty well with our prediction. Let's make sure it's the best one. So we're going to hang on to it and read through the other answer choices. The name of the country does not apply to most citizens who therefore frequently disregard the name. That sounds a bit like B, right? But it takes it farther. See the difference between the tone. Has less significance is more neutral than does not apply. You always want to be careful about picking answers that go beyond the level in the text, that go more extreme. If the text says sometimes, you don't want to say always. The text says rarely. You don't want to pick an answer that says never. You don't want to go more extreme than what's supported in the passage here. So this idea of does not apply goes too far, not supported by the text here. So we can use that to eliminate C. And then for D, the name of the country refers to an area that does not include the region of Kurdistan. Again, that's not referring back to the first sentence, the name of Iraq. So we can eliminate D. Though you should read beyond, should you only answer the question based on, yeah, so that's absolutely right. It is 65 minutes for this section. And yeah, so we want to read further for context, but we want to make sure that we're answering based on basically this first introduction of the name Iraq. So that's a good question. Even though Kurdistan and the Shia, all that stuff comes later, none of it ties back to the name of Iraq, right? This is in direct contrast to France, Portugal, the United States. So we want to make sure that we're tied up in the identities there and not getting into the details that do show up later in the passage. So we've identified all our trap answers here. We didn't fall for any of them. And we do want to go with B here. The name of the country has less significance in Iraq than it does in other countries like France, Portugal, the United States. See how this is like a total paraphrase from what we read in the text? We didn't have any of these words in here. And that's going to be the case for a lot of the right answers on this test. So don't be tempted to pick an answer just because it recycles a lot of the words that you remember reading. Okay. Let's try another one with this passage. According to the author, how do Westerners identify with the towns, cities, or states in which they live? So here we don't have a line reference, but we do have a really good lead word, which is going to be Westerners. So we want to make sure that we find Westerners in the passage and we read what the author is saying about them, particularly with respect to towns, cities, or states. So let's go back and read. And as we're going, we're trying to make a prediction for how Westerners identify with those places. I see a question. Can we solve the writing section before reading? No, the reading comes up first. So you get 65 minutes for reading, and then the writing and language section is next, and then the 2 math sections, and then the essays all the way at the end. That's going to be how the SAT is set up. So because reading is up first, we are going to find the relationship between the Westerners and basically their identification with town, city, or state. So let's see what the author says. For many Westerners, nationality is a given and ultimately trumps the more local identifications of town, city, or state. So nationality is a given and basically comes before the local identifications. So that's what we want to keep as a prediction. We want to make sure that the right answer says something along those lines. So let's take a look at our answers, see if we can find something that matches, and see if we can knock out anything that looks like a trap to us. These local identifications play some role, but the idea of belonging to a nation is more important. Does that match up with our prediction? It does pretty well, right? Some role is, pretty neutral. It doesn't go too far. Um, but the idea of belonging to a nation is more important. Nationality is a given, ultimately trumps the more local identification. So we're going to hold on to that, make sure it's our best possible option here. These local identifications hold some importance, also sounds good, right? But are trumped by religious identifications. So see how they're recycling that word trumped that we remember reading in there? So up until that point, this looks a lot like a right answer. But then this is where we get into the idea where if an answer choice is a little bit wrong, it's wrong. By religious identifications, do we have anything to support the idea of religious identifications with Westerners? We don't, right? That goes back to the Iraqis, which comes later. But this question is only asking about Westerners, so we can eliminate B. What importance does reading speed play in the test? Not as much as you would think. Again, it's more just about having a really concrete strategy and knowing exactly what you're going to do when you get to each passage. If you identify as a slow reader, that's not necessarily going to hold you back as much as you might think on this test. And a strong vocabulary. So you guys are lucky. Way back when Rachel and I were taking the SAT, they had tested vocabulary out of context completely. So you would see questions like, you'd see like cat is to kitten as, I don't know, goose is to what? And there wouldn't be a word bank, there wouldn't be sentences. You would just have to know the word for a baby goose. But this would obviously be like much more abstract and complicated vocabulary. And they ultimately decided that that wasn't a good idea. So they took that stuff out. So you don't have to study vocab as hard as Rachel and I did back in the day. But yeah, it's still a good idea to have a comfortable vocabulary. So if you feel like that's something that you struggle with, again, there's really great flashcard apps out there. Or get some paper ones. Those exist too. Carry those around with you. I know you all have a lot of free time on your hands these days. Now's a great time to build that vocabulary back up. You are not going to have to do stuff like this. All the vocab questions you have in SAT, those are going to be vocabulary in context. There's going to be words around it that help you understand what word needs to go in there. Okay. The best thing to do just before the SAT begins with the reading test, the morning of the test and the day before. Yeah, so make sure the day before you set out everything you need, put fresh batteries in your calculator, grab your pencils, set out the clothes you're gonna wear, pick out, your snacks, have your water bottle, get everything ready the night before. Make sure you get a good night's sleep. Um, and, just be prepared for an unpredictable morning. You might show up really early and then have a really long wait before the test actually starts for whatever reason. So just, practice, deep breaths, just understanding that some things are out of your control, but what is in your control is what you do once that test does actually start. Um, so, just, understanding the unpredictability of it and being able to accept that and just be in a good headspace for whenever the test does start. Another thing that I like to recommend if you start to feel yourself tensing up, if you've ever had that experience, particularly with like a 4-hour test, if you start to feel really tight and like hunch over your desk, put your pencil down, sit back, and take 3 deep breaths. If you time yourself doing it, I promise it's going to be like 11 seconds. You can seconds on this test. That'll help you recenter. Um, okay, so going back to question 13. We just eliminated answer B. The local identifications are most important in European countries such as France and Portugal. So we're suspicious right now because they're recycling France, they're recycling Portugal. Um, and we want to make sure if they're recycling language like that, then it's supported. And so do we see any distinction about like France and Portugal being, more heavy on the local identifications? They don't, right? They put France, Portugal, and the US all in one bucket and say that nationality is a given there. So this one recycles a lot of that language, but just doesn't give it to us in the right way. It's not supported by the text. Okay, so last one here, these local identifications are less important than both religious and national identifications. So this is one, again, where it's so close to being right, but it's a little bit wrong, and that's with this word religious. So if it's a little bit wrong, the whole answer is wrong. You got to throw the whole thing out. So we want to go back to answer A, which was our least problematic answer. These local identifications play some role, but the idea of belonging to a nation is more important. I don't have a crystal ball with the future SATs. I just know that it's in the College Board's best interest to make sure that these tests happen somehow. So the best thing that you guys can do is just prepare and hope, unfortunately. But there hasn't been an SAT anywhere since March, so we're all pulling for these tests to happen in the fall. Okay, any other questions on number 13 before we move on to another example? Okay. So we're moving on to a different passage now, and we're going to read and understand our question here. So in line 8, fortunate swimmers refers to the authors. So basically, what does fortunate swimmers refer back to? What does it mean here? So we want to make sure that we're finding that phrase in the text and also that we're understanding what it functions as here. So we see it at the end. So let's go ahead and read this whole paragraph and see what's going on. I now had what amounted to a complex about music. Hopes had been raised too high, and when they crashed too low, I could not be objective. Perhaps I had not admitted it to myself, but Town Hall in New York had represented the mainstream of American musical life, and I had plunged into it hoping to become one of the fortunate swimmers. Where does it say the local identifications played some role? Good question. It's not going to use those words, right? It's going to be a paraphrase. It trumps the more local identifications. So there are local identifications, but they're just less important than nationality. If you didn't identify at all, then it wouldn't say that there were local identifications to begin with. Super good question. Okay. So Town Hall in New York had represented the mainstream of American musical life, and I had plunged into it hoping to become one of the fortunate swimmers. So for this question, if we hadn't read the passage and not given a line reference and don't know which paragraph to refer to, what do we do then? So remember, SAT questions show up chronologically. So you can use that to narrow down. So if question 2 is in line 10 and question 4 is in line 30, question 3 is going to be somewhere in the middle. You can use that chronology to zero in on the window. But otherwise, don't if you can't find a question, save it. You don't have to, just because the questions appear chronologically doesn't mean you have to do them in order. You can come back to it. Um, you've all been conditioned for the most part to do questions in order as they appear to you on this test. That's not always going to be the best approach. So if you truly cannot find the topic of a question, then just, answer the other questions. Likely what's going to happen is in answering another question, you're going to find that topic and you're going to say, oh yeah, there it is. So give yourself that opportunity. Don't spin your wheels trying to find something that you're having trouble finding. Okay. So we have an author who had plunged. So we've got this basically swimming metaphor for singing going on here. She had plunged into it, into the American musical life, hoping to become one of the fortunate swimmers. So she's, trying to become some sort of a famous singer. And we want to go through and see basically if we can eliminate any trap answers and actually figure out what she's meaning when she refers to fortunate swimmers. So, obsession with music. We see that that matches up really closely with she had now had what amounted to a complex about music. But does that mean the same thing? And is that related to fortunate swimmers? Two problems with answer A. It's recycling the language, which is already going to make us suspicious, and it's not tied back to what's going on in line 8. So that's a trap, and we can eliminate answer A. What about desire to be a popular singer? Well, she had, um, plunged into this mainstream of American musical life at the town hall in New York. So there's this, ambition that we see going on here. So this sounds plausible. Maybe we don't love it. If this was an open-ended test, nobody would often choose the answers that you're given here, but that's by design. If they make the right answers look too good, everybody's going to pick them. So even if you don't love it, if it's not problematic, hang on to it and check out the other answers. Respect for other famous singers. Again, there's a problem with this idea of respect. It's plausible, right? It sounds perfectly reasonable, but we don't have evidence to support it with this idea of her calling them fortunate swimmers. So that's one where it could be true, but we don't have evidence, so we can't pick it. That's how cut and dry this is. And D reads rapid change of fortune. So we're suspicious already because this idea of fortune ties back into the word fortunate. Can't have that necessarily, just because it's recycling a word doesn't mean that it's going to be the right answer. In fact, the opposite. We want to be suspicious of that. And there's no evidence for this rapid, right? That she had any sort of rapid change of fortune. That's kind of speculation that we don't have support for. So we read through all the answers, kind of liked B, but found concrete issues with all the other ones. And so that's what you need to do. You don't want to spin your wheels here trying to convince yourself that that's going to be the way to go when you've found problems with all the other answers. It just doesn't tie back into what the fortunate swimmers is referring to. Okay. So this is kind of a parallel to the vocabulary and context question where you've just got to figure out what it means based on the stuff around it. Let's try another one. So this one's all about the third paragraph, which is good. So that's going to be lines 29 or 24 to 28, excuse me. So when they give you a paragraph reference, you want to make sure that you're reading above and below. You never just want to read an island of what they are giving you. So we're asked to find what the third paragraph primarily focuses on. So what's the main idea of the third paragraph? So, right answers are not, I don't like that idea of perfect, but they're not always lovable. You can always say like, I wouldn't really say it that way, because they are going to be paraphrases of what's in the text. They're often not going to be, if you had a blank to write in an answer, they're not going to be something that you would be likely to fill in that blank with. And so that's kind of what makes this test tricky. Okay, so let's read above and below this third paragraph. If you are sensitive, and I was perhaps too sensitive, a misrepresentation like that can throw you off balance, particularly if you feel like you have a great deal at stake. I stopped going regularly to Mr. Baghetti's studio. I appeared once in a while, and things must have gone very indifferently. He realized how much the fiasco had shaken me, and he did not make an issue of my irregular attendance. Mother and I talked through the whole thing, and her patience and understanding, she helped me out of my trouble. Okay, so a question about the earlier problem. You thought it couldn't be singers since it only mentioned music. So the tricky part with doing these on like a YouTube live stream is we don't have the whole passage in front of us. If you were to read further, it does go into her singing career. So just because we don't have it in this little window, I wish that we could just put the whole passage up on the screen, but then it would be too small for anybody to see. So that's just a function of this format, but not an indication that singing isn't going to show up later in the passage. I see someone tends to miss some questions regarding main purpose and main idea. Yeah, so that's kind of like a Goldilocks problem, right? The main idea, so sometimes the wrong answer for a main idea question will be a detail that's true. And sometimes a wrong answer will be a scope that's too broad. So you want to make sure that you're saving those for last. Again, the theme of the other questions is going to clue you in on what the authors of the test think is important. And you just want to, make sure you're not going too broad or too narrow, really focusing on the scope of the paragraph of the passage. So really for main idea questions, so for these detail questions, it's always essential to go back and read. But for main idea, it's not necessarily. So if you're saving those for last, first of all, you've already read most of the passage in chunks trying to answer questions. You've had time to think about the theme of the questions as you've gone through. So I would read through the answers and eliminate anything that you know is not supported by what you read. And then if you've got it down to a couple, if you can't get yourself there, then go back and kind of skim through and look for problems with one of the answers in terms of scope. But it's not usually necessary to read the whole entire passage from top to bottom to get the answer to those questions right. You just want to make sure that you're not answering those questions first when you haven't read any of the passage, because then it's going to be too hard and you're going to have to read that stuff anyway to answer the more specific questions. Um, so if you get a certain number of questions incorrect, so this is a tricky thing because every test administration is curved based on the performance of the students that took it that day. So you can find rubrics online that'll give you an approximation, but it's not going to be exact because they're going to have to fudge it a little bit to get everybody under that bell curve. But you can find the SAT reading rubric and approximate how many questions you can miss to get a certain score. But it's not going to be an exact science ever. Okay. So again, going back to this third paragraph, we've got a few events going on here. Um, and in particular, I see like the fiasco. He realized how much whatever the fiasco was, had shaken me, and he didn't make an issue of my irregular attendance. Um, okay, so I see, do we see give exactly 13 minutes for each passage, and do we mark answer simultaneously? Okay, yeah, do not race to bubble in at the end. You definitely want to be bubbling in as you go. And for 13 minutes for each passage, I don't think that's the best approach because we all know that some passages are easier than others. And depending on what your goal score is, it might be appropriate to guess completely on the hardest passage on the test. So I recommend doing them in order. Do the easiest passages first, build your way up so that you're either doing the hardest passage last or you're running out the clock on the hardest passage because you could spend a lot of time on those questions and maybe still miss them. So you want to make sure that you're spending your time wisely on questions that you're likely to get right. Um, and so 13 minutes per passage, I think, is not really the best approach. But do enough practice tests that you have a good idea of what your pacing is. It's always a good idea to, just notice how long you're taking on each passage and then how many questions you're getting right. That'll clue you in on which ones you should do first and which ones you should maybe save for last or guess on entirely. So let's see what's going on with this fiasco. And again, Mother and I had talked about the whole thing, and with her patience and understanding helped me out of my trouble. So we don't know exactly what went on here. But let's, keep that stuff in mind and go into this question and try to look for some answers that just don't make sense. So the third paragraph focuses on A says the importance of rehearsals. Um, we don't really have that here, right? So she had stopped going to the studio, but there's nothing to support this idea of the importance of going in the first place. So this is one that, yeah, rehearsals are important. That's a logical thing to say, but it's not supported by the passage here. Should you spend more time on questions you can get right? You should spend your time, you shouldn't spend an inordinate amount of time, but you should make sure that you give yourself time to answer questions that you're likely to get right. Absolutely. You don't want to rush through them because you're trying to answer every single question on this test. That's an easy way to make mistakes. Okay, so the kindness of strangers for B. Um, I don't know. Do we have strangers here? Do we have kindness? Maybe Mr. Baghetti was nice to her, but it says that things had gone very indifferently. So we don't have a lot of support for answer B with this one either. Okay. C says the return to a musical career. Again, she stopped going to the studio, but we don't have anything to support this idea that there was, a stop and then a return. So this idea is a little bit problematic. But if we're not sure about that, let's read D, the consequences of a performance. So again, we see some of these strange ideas like the fiasco, my trouble. So maybe there was something that went wrong, and she says, if I was perhaps too sensitive. So we get the idea that something maybe bad happened. Um, but then, he didn't make an issue of her irregular attendance. So this is what had happened after some performance. Maybe that's referring back to the fiasco, to the trouble. So D is the least problematic answer choice, and that's the one that we want to go with here. Any specific thing to keep in mind for attitude and tone questions? Not necessarily. Just, that's going to be consistent more or less through the passage. Um, and again, you want to go with like the Goldilocks thing here. So you don't want to go, if the author is a more academic tone, you don't want to say that he's super enthusiastic about something or that he's completely indifferent. Maybe it's going to be somewhere in between. So not too extreme in either direction. That's typically where you'll see trap answers for attitude and for tone questions. Okay, we're almost at the hour, so we've got time just for a few more questions. If there's any questions on number 5, I would be happy to take them, or any questions at all. Yeah, reading can be tough because it's not testing a lot of the skills that you've been learning throughout your English classes, but there are some concrete ways that you can improve your approach to these sections to improve your score. And so practice is definitely the best way to do it. If you haven't tried out a practice test or even just a practice reading section using some of these strategies, I'd recommend that you do that. Whether you're signed up to take the SAT on August 29th or later this fall or next year or the year after, whatever that may be, practice is the very best way to prepare for these tests. And there's lots and lots of ways to be able to do that in a way that's going to improve your score. So I just want to thank everybody for your really great participation today. This was a lot of fun. I hope you learned something. Come back and see us next week. We're always happy to share our wisdom and help prepare everybody to do their very best score on the SAT or the ACT, whatever that case may be. I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day, great rest of your summer, and we'll see you next time. Thank you so much.